Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM. In this episode, I speak to Elena Aguilar about how to use transformational coaching to thrive at work and in life. Elena is a best-selling author and coaching expert known for her 8 books on coaching and leadership development. This includes The Art of Coaching and The Art of Coaching Teams. Her forthcoming comprehensive coaching book, Arise, The Art of Transformational Coaching, highlights conversational skills to help you thrive, and it will be released in July 2024. She hosts the Bright Morning podcast, where she shares tools for educators. Elena is the founder and CEO of Bright Morning Consulting, an organization dedicated to empowering educators and leaders with the skills and insights needed to create resilient and inclusive learning environments. Through Bright Morning, Elena offers workshops, coaching, and consulting services focusing on equity, social justice, and emotional resilience. In this episode, we discuss a number of different themes drawing on Elena's expertise. We talk about the transformative approach that she has built and that she promotes towards education and coaching. We talk about emotional resilience, what exactly it is, and what are the key habits that help us build emotional resilience. So Elena has put forward 12 habits in her book Onward, Cultivating Emotional Resilience in Educators, 12 science-backed habits that cultivate resilience and the correlative dispositions of these habits. And we talk about how she came about these 12 habits, why they're so important, and how to go about cultivating them. She talks about some of the key skills that we need to learn, but also unlearn in order to thrive. We talk about what makes a thriving conversation, or rather a conversation that can help us thrive at work and in life. And what are some of the hazards we need to watch out for? We're having conversations for them to, not be those that can help us thrive, or can be those that in fact could, even cause us to languish. She's worked extensively in education, and we talk about her vast experience, what she's learned throughout that, and what she thinks are the most effective way to promote flourishing within education based on her experiences, and her approach towards coaching, transformational coaching, what exactly that is, and how we can use those skills and tools in order to promote thriving, both for ourselves and for communities of people more widely. It's a fantastic conversation. I learned loads from it. Hope you enjoy this conversation with Elena Aguilar. Elena, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great, John. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for our podcast. And there's so much we'd love to discuss with you here today, given your vast experience as an educator, as a coach, best-selling author, trainer, and so on. Let's start off with your extensive experience in education. So you've worked in education since 1994, and particularly in public schools in Oakland, California. You've taught or trained tens of thousands of people from over 100 countries. How have you seen the landscape of education change the past 30 years in terms of providing better or worse support to flourishing for students and educators?
That is a great question for us to reflect on. And there's so many layers when we think about where there has been growth and development and hope, and where there has been perhaps backsliding in terms of the progress that's been made in education. Some of the areas that I see as hopeful and reflective of the direction that I think will ultimately help humanity is perhaps around the incorporation of social and emotional learning for young people, the integration of teaching them emotional intelligence and so on feels incredibly important, and particularly as we move into even more uncertain times and see the rates of mental health issues and concerns for young people rising rapidly. And I think there have been a lot of advances in the way that curriculum is thought about, in creating and providing relevant, meaningful curriculum for students. So I like to focus on the growth and the possibilities. I think there's definitely a lot more attention on what adults need in order to be successful and to thrive, and the awareness that not only do we need to attend to young people's social and emotional needs, but we also need to attend to those for the adults who are in the building.
I take it that you're working with school leaders as well as educators, right? As well as teachers.
Teachers, coaches, school leaders, district leaders, organizational leaders, superintendents, folks in nonprofits that support schools, folks in for-profits that support schools, all the people who ultimately are in the line of work that we're in to support children.
Wow. Okay. So the entire network of people, more or less, working in a school or with a school in various capacities. So connected with this, then, there's a growing movement aiming to promote flourishing in schools worldwide, right? And a growing, the view that the ultimate aim of education is to promote flourishing is becoming more and more popular year on year. So you mentioned some key areas there. What do you think are the most important areas schools should focus on to support the flourishing of students, but also the flourishing of teachers and school leaders?
A place to start is to define what we mean by flourishing. What are the goals or the vision or the outcomes that we're working towards? And that's important because that will surface and help us see places where we have shared values and where perhaps there are differences in the strategies or the actions we can take to create something concrete and realized out of those values. And so I think there's opportunity for us to explore some of the thornier and trickier areas that we grapple with in our education system. But in terms of what does it mean to flourish, or I use the word thrive in my organization, what does it mean to thrive? I think one of the most useful advances, perhaps in the last 30, 50 years, is all the science coming out about our brains and our bodies and our emotions. And so understanding the neuroscience behind our emotions and behind how we help people grow. And then particularly just honing in on one specific resource or tool that we could use is the way that psychologists describe our core human needs. At the top of that list of core human needs is the need for belonging and connection. And as a social species, we know that intuitively, and we've experienced that. And if we organized schools and the experience for children and adults around just that core human need, the need for belonging, we'd see radical shifts in our schools. We'd see radical shifts in the experiences and the outcomes of children. We'd see radical shifts in the retention of teachers and administrators. And we'd experienced something really different when we walked into buildings in which belonging is centered. And by extension, the additional core human needs, the need for autonomy or agency or empowerment, the need for purpose and meaning, the need for genuine self-esteem, the need for trust. Those are the core human needs. And if we could simply organize what we do, both in work contexts and for children around those, we'd see something really different.
Wow. Thank you. Okay. There's a load of questions I'd like to follow that up with. So then the first point was, it depends how we define flourishing, and you like to use the word thriving as well, both in your work, but also in your books as well. So let's start with that. So is there a particular definition or conceptualization of flourishing or thriving that you work with in your work?
So I define thriving as when our core human needs are met. And that is the foundation, really, in order for us to be resilient as individuals and as communities. And so there's a sort of sequencing or a foundational starting point from which we then think about the individual and the community. And so I also work a lot on resilience, emotional resilience for individuals and for communities. And so there's all these connections. I like the word flourishing too. I think there's elements of, we can bring in Maslow's hierarchy and there's a lot of overlap between the core human needs and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I do like to incorporate the need for transcendence that he really brought in later on in his work that is sometimes left out of his pyramid. But the need for humans to have that experience of transcendence is another component of what allows for us to thrive or flourish or be resilient.
Okay, this is fascinating. Thank you. So, is it, following Maslow's conceptualization, are you then, on your definition of thriving and what you would like to see happen for students and educators and school leaders, everyone involved in a school community, is it for them to self-actualize, to reach self-actualization?
I think that's a really important component. And I think my hesitation around that is that we can't separate the individual from the collective.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I think the only the element that needs to be expanded on from self-actualization is that there is no self-actualization without community actualization.
Right.
And so we can't separate it out. And so we think about the individual and the community or the collective as inseparable. And so, yes, but I do think self-actualization, it's that can you live up to your potential? Do you know what your potential is? Do you do what you feel like you're here on earth to do, that sort of purpose, meaning, potential? And that's where I think we get to the edges of transcendence, which is I think a really interesting edge to get to and to include, because I think schools have primarily done a great job at being organized around the intellect or the mind. And yet, this is where I come back to the findings from neuroscience and the connection between the mind and the body, and that there is no separation, and the connection we can say between the mind and the body and the emotions. And then perhaps I'm very hesitant to even reference or to name, but something like the spirit, the soul, something else that we have a hard time talking about, but there's a need for that to be addressed, whether that's through the experience of something like giving kids access to music or art or creative writing, or whether that is something that's expressed just in community circles when kids are sitting around in the morning talking about the upcoming day. So I want to just kind of note that and point to it as schools, to thrive or to flourish, we need to be in an environment that recognizes our holistic experience as human beings, our whole experience. The mind, the body, the emotional experience, the spirit, and that's when we thrive.
Nice. Yeah, that's a nice way of phrasing it, the wholeness of a human being. So let's just clarify for listeners as well, what exactly is meant by transcendence here. So is it kind of an understanding of, perhaps, to bring it into more everyday terms, because you mentioned like you're in a spirit, perhaps even your soul, is it to reach an understanding of really what makes you in terms of your persona, your character, who you are as a whole person, and or to transcend any potential that people believed you had or had ascribed to you at an early age that maybe wasn't true about your actual potential, and or is it some kind of experience of something beyond our worldly existence? Because sometimes people use transcendence in that way, right? An experience of something higher, as it were. Which of those, or which combination of those is it, or is it something else altogether?
So I think in the context that I used that phrase just now, I was talking about Maslow's incorporation of transcendence. And in that case, he was talking about the something else that maybe we experience when we're watching a beautiful sunset and we just feel sort of that sense of awe. I really love Dacher Keltner's work around awe.
Yeah.
And that's the name of his book. His most recent book is Awe. And, or whether that is the experience that someone has, a child has, a grown-up has, when they are in a flow state and they're creating a piece of art, or they're deep into an engineering project. And so I'm kind of just pointing to that as how do we give young people and adults that kind of experience? I would say as a coach, I have that kind of experience when I'm coaching someone and I'm listening, and I'm really listening with full presence. I go into that state of flow where you lose track of time, where you're just so in the moment. And in those moments, in that connection with the other person and that listening experience, I do feel like I'm having an experience of something bigger that I can't really describe. That's like, I don't know what's going on, but I just feel really connected to this moment, this person. There's something indescribable happening here. So that's what I'm sort of pointing at when I
Yeah.
talk about the sentence.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. And yeah, it would be great if we could facilitate flow more in schools for sure, and in workplaces too. Absolutely. But that's very clear. Thank you. So let's just to get your definition of thriving or flourishing on the table. Then it is for a person's core needs to be met, for them to experience transcendence in the sense in which Maslow describes it. And those core needs include areas, in particular, include belonging, a sense of belonging, but also meaning, the need for autonomy, the need for self-esteem, the need for trust, and several other areas too, but particularly belonging. That's the one you laid most emphasis on when you described it. Why do you think that is so important for schools?
I think that the crisis we're facing in the world is one of not belonging, of feeling separate, alienated, of isolation and loneliness. And I think that's been exacerbated by the last few years. I think it has unfortunately been exacerbated by social media.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true for young people. We have never lived in communities or in a world which has been as wonderfully diverse as it is now. And that can be both a means to deeper connection or one that creates more gaps. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about what it takes for young people to feel, or grownups to feel like they belong, part of that includes that their identity experiences are recognized, acknowledged, welcomed, accepted, that they are safe in whatever their identity experiences are, whatever their race or ethnicity is, their gender, their religion, their socioeconomic background, their sexual orientation. All of those identity experiences contribute to someone feeling like they belong, or the opposite. And so these very core experiences of being a human, we're social creatures. We need each other. We want each other. And how do we create communities where we can, this is, the work of understanding, listening, tolerance, acceptance, all of that.
Okay, so I take it that's, if there was one major change you'd love to see take place in education to better support flourishing, both of students and educators and other people in education, such as school leaders, and one that you're working towards, it's to create a greater sense of belonging.
Yes. And I also know that we can create a sense of belonging in every conversation that we have. And so I go from the big aspirational vision to the concrete. This is what I write about. This is what I teach. How do we make conversations be the microcosm for the world we want to create, for the kind of belonging we want to experience? How do we listen to each other in a way that helps us be in someone else's shoes, recognize their experience, understand their perspectives, even if we disagree with them or we think we're going to disagree with them? And then how do we have conversations which are ways for us to create the kind of belonging connection we want to be experiencing in every place, every day?
Wow. Is this part of the theme of your forthcoming book, Arise?
I would say definitely. So I would say this book is, what are all the tools that we can learn? Because these are tools, these are skills that we can learn that enable us to individually and collectively thrive, to be able to grapple. We've got so many enormous, overwhelming challenges facing our world and our communities these days. We have to be able to talk to each other in order to address those. So how do we do that? That's what I do a lot of, as I said, sort of going back and forth between the big picture and okay, let me tell you how to do this. Let's talk about your listening. Let's talk about where your mind goes when you're listening. Are you formulating the next thing you're going to say? Or are you truly taking in what someone says? What do you do if you recognize that you always go into fix-it mode and you don't really listen? You hear the words and then you come back with a piece of advice or a suggestion. So I really break it down into these components of what it takes for us to shift our behaviors and our beliefs and our ways of being so that we can connect
Fantastic. So just to introduce this book a bit to listeners. So this is your forthcoming book. You've written 8 books, and this will be your 8th book, forthcoming in July 2024. Arise, the Art of Transformational Coaching. And the book is described as a hands-on and practical roadmap to results for transformational coaches and leaders working in school environments, which guides readers through the skills, beliefs, and dispositions that will enable us to thrive at work and in life, and to create the conditions in which all those around us thrive as well. And this is a really interesting avenue to go down. That an important part of the book is you describing and you laying out a roadmap as to how to have these kinds of conversations, which are themselves transformational, partly in terms of how they help to facilitate belonging. So can you please tell us a little more about how we go about having those kinds of transformational conversations?
Sure. And so these are conversations that we might have with someone who we are supporting to grow, to develop. And so I write for people working in the education system, but more broadly, really for anybody who has, this could be a direct report, this could be your own child, this could be students that you mentor in a neighboring community, and you want to think about helping them reflect on what they do and helping them grow. And so I can loop back to, we start with listening, because how we listen will inform how we respond. And how we respond informs what comes next. This includes thinking about what are the goals? Where are we trying to get to if we are trying to help someone learn and grow? Do we have a specific place we're trying to get them to? So, for example, I have a 20-year-old son, and I think about how much I used my coaching skills when he was in high school. And all the mornings when he was running late, and all the mornings when I could have gotten really frustrated with him and said, you're going to be late to school again. And how many times I took a coaching stance either before or at the end of the day and said, let's talk about the impact that it has on you and on me and on everyone when you are late. And what can you do about this? So in that case, I had a very specific goal that I was trying to get him to arrive at, which was getting up on time.
Yeah.
There's other times when we are taking a coaching stance when we may not have a specific goal that we're getting someone to, that we want to explore. Okay, something needs to shift. Let's figure out what it is. So I'm kind of going narrow and focused into this one strain. When my coaching model is different from other coaching models in schools and perhaps elsewhere, in that it focuses on addressing behaviors, beliefs, and ways of being. And the premise there, the understanding, so much of my work is informed by neuroscience, by psychology, by sociology. But the connection there is that all of our behaviors emerge from beliefs, whether we're conscious of it or not. Every single thing we do comes from a belief that we have. And so in order to create sustained and transformational change, we actually need to have the skills to help someone cultivate awareness of what the beliefs are that they're holding, to explore those, and perhaps to shift them. And so that's a key component of my approach to coaching. And the other component that I referenced is ways of being. That's who you are being, how you're showing up. That includes how you might act on or embody your values. It also includes a lot of awareness of and attention to emotions and how we work with emotions.
Great, thank you. So let's continue a little more on that model of coaching, that model of transformational coaching in your book. You describe it in the book as radical in its scope, and it has at the center collective well-being. So can we dig a bit more into what exactly transformational coaching is? I mean, I take it's to bring about these kinds of needs that you mentioned, these connection with these base, these important human needs such as belonging. But why exactly? How exactly you go about facilitating collective well-being through this process of coaching?
So the health of an individual will dramatically impact the health of the collective. My theory of action is we start with the individual and then help them bring their shifting awareness, shifting skills, practices, behaviors, beliefs into groups. So my second book is The Art of Coaching Teams. I also have a book about designing and facilitating professional development. And so my work tends to go back and forth between helping individuals become more reflective, more informed decision makers, and then helping them make those connections to how they show up in teams, in groups, in a school setting, in a community. And that we use the same skills. It's just a scaling up when we're with other people. It can be tricky.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. And a little more on the kind of the role of conversations, or how to best do it. So, you mentioned some of the ways we can have these better conversations in order to thrive. What are some of the main mistakes that people make in conversations that prevent them from having these kind of great conversations? What are some tips to improve the quality of conversations in order for those conversations to help us to thrive more?
Yeah. Well, I think anyone listening could actually just pause there and think about what kind of feedback they've been given about their communication skills, their listening. A lot of times that's when we get feedback like, you're just not listening to me.
Yeah.
Or did you hear anything I said? So we get feedback, or we know that when someone else is talking and they go on too long, we might space out, or that when they start talking, they're talking about something we disagree with, we're starting to formulate the answers that we're going to come back with. We're going to argue this or that. There is, I'll shift from that because I've talked about some of the listening skills and ways that we listen that are less helpful. There are ways that we can learn to listen that are more conducive to creating belonging. So there's a way that I talk about listening through what I call expansive listening lenses. Mm-hmm. And so I say our minds want to help us. They need direction. Sometimes when we don't give them direction, they are going to run into their channel of listening for danger, listening for what I disagree with. Again, that's just a leftover, perhaps unhealthy evolutionary remnant that we're dealing with, right? So we have to deal with our biology, our neurobiology, and that is what sometimes sends us into listening for danger and wanting to fight back. If we tell our minds, listen for possibility, listen for hope, listen with curiosity, listen with love, our minds can be really responsive. Like, thank you for giving me that direction. Okay, in this conversation, I'm going to listen with curiosity. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we need to actually learn how to be curious, because curiosity requires a level of psychological safety. We can create that within ourselves so that we can listen to someone speaking and find our way into our genuine curiosity, not faux curiosity where we ask a question that's actually an attempt at giving advice or giving our opinion, but genuine curiosity.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
This connects with another key point of the training that you have put forward and that you run at your company, Bright Morning. That part of its approach towards improving education is that schools must be transformed to become equitable places of learning. And I was interested in particular in this is part of Bright Morning's statement of its vision, that this requires learning and unlearning on the parts of adults leading in schools. So I was just thinking then, as you were talking about things to watch out for, things to improve upon to make, bad or not necessarily bad, but average conversations, or ones that aren't the kinds of conversations that are going to help us flourish, into ones that are transformative and help us flourish. What kind of things do we need to not only learn, but unlearn? Like you mentioned there, learning to be curious in the appropriate way. Now, most adults kind of know what it is and know what it means to be curious, but maybe need to unlearn a certain type of curiosity or kind of foster a certain type of curious approach towards things. So what are kind of some of the key areas, not just of knowledge, but also skills that you think people need to learn or unlearn in order to promote thriving in conversations, but also in more applicable contexts, for example, to transform schools in the way that you try to do in your training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So if we start with the premise that our current reality, our current institutions and communities have been shaped in reflection of dominant culture.
Mm-hmm.
And dominant culture is one right now which is characterized by a whole number of systems of oppression: racism, capitalism, patriarchy. So all of our conversations actually have elements of those aspects of dominant culture in them. That often shows up in power dynamics, that often shows up in internalized beliefs about how certain people need to communicate and respond. So, for example, let's say a teacher goes to their principal frustrated about something. The principal is likely to feel like, because of their position, they need to give answers. They need to take care of the problem. They need to fix the situation. This will be perhaps intensified or impacted by the gender of the two people here, the teacher and the principal. So let's say the teacher is female and the principal is male. Let's say there's an age difference as well. There are so many identity markers that can make this conversation be one that even more profoundly reflects the inequities in dominant culture. So I'm wanting to really break this down and give you this picture of all that we need to unlearn. We need to unlearn a whole lot about power dynamics, about how solutions can be found. And so let's say that principal has this upset teacher, and the principal recognizes that in spite of the age differences, the gender, their positional power, the principal can actually say to the teacher, "I'm so glad you came to me. This sounds like a really hard situation. I can hear how difficult this is for you and how much grief this is causing you. And let's sit down and I want to hear your thoughts about how to respond to this situation." So the principal is withholding giving their opinion and telling the teacher what to do. The principal is acknowledging the teacher's vulnerability, acknowledging their emotional experiences. The principal might even say, "This makes me feel really sad as well." We need to relearn relating to our emotions, talking about our emotions. We need to relearn that emotions are normal and they are sources of wisdom. We don't need to manage them. We don't need to regulate them. We don't need to leave them outside of the school door. We're much more empowered, effective, and able to flourish or thrive when we welcome in our emotions and when we are with each other with our emotions, when we're vulnerable with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that principal needs to unlearn a whole lot about what it means to be in a position of power and what it could mean to be in a relationship with someone where you still have the positional power, but you don't come into the conversation needing to solve the problem or thinking that you know what the problem is.
Right. Thank you. That's wonderfully described and a nice, clear example. Let's go a bit further into that example to really bring out some of these skills that we need to learn, relearn, or unlearn. So in that example, it would be for example, it would be that a problem doesn't necessarily have to be solved as the outcome of this interaction, but it might that a great outcome of this interaction between the principal and the teacher might simply be that the teacher felt heard and listened to, had a chance to discuss the problems that he or she felt they were facing. Oh, it was in the example he gave, it was a she, felt they were facing at that time. And that as a result of that, the teacher felt more comfortable maybe in their role or going about their role in the typical school day, because they'd had a chance to speak about it with the principal and they felt heard. That's one example, right, of a skill that needs to be learned, or rather unlearned and learned.
And I would just add that one of the other outcomes is that the teacher feels a greater sense of empowerment and agency. And overwhelmingly, what I hear from people in schools as well as outside of schools is that they are experiencing a tremendous sense of powerlessness. And so I look for opportunities in every conversation to help someone tap into their sense of power. And so in that scenario I gave you, if the principal refrains from offering suggestions and helps the teacher identify possible next steps or solutions, that teacher is going to have a greater sense of empowerment or agency. And that is what propels us. That way, next time there's a challenge that arises, she actually might have some ideas already about how to respond.
I see. Okay, this is fascinating. So in your training, this is one of the key areas you focus on, trying to help educators, school leaders in particular, but also other people who take the training, to unlearn certain practices, skills that have been deeply entrenched by societal structures, and learn a more effective, more appropriate, better way to act in today's world of work, world of education in the 21st century. That's the kind of one of the key things you focus on in your training?
Yes, I'd say so. And I would actually add, sometimes it's helping us remember that actually we know these skills and we just forgot them, or we think that we're not allowed to use them. But I think we actually know how to connect to each other. And in my trainings, what I do in part is give people experiences of connection, of doing things differently, of practicing a new skill. And that way it becomes embodied. It becomes something that is encoded in our neural networks. And so the trainings are the opportunity to practice and experience what I write about in my books, because we can't read our way into new behaviors.
Yeah.
Reading is great. We get new ideas, acquire new knowledge, but that doesn't actually translate into new behavior.
Absolutely. We need to practice the skills that we acquire and learn and live these out more throughout our lives, rather than just learning about them, or rather that those ways of acting are ways of learning. Absolutely. So what kind of change have you seen in the schools that you've worked with where you're engaged in this training?
I've seen so many things. I would say everything from I've seen educators just take a deep breath. I've seen people slow down just a little bit. I've seen people recognize, give me a second. Let me think about that for a moment. I've seen classrooms become ones in which students go from sitting in rows and listening to a teacher talk for an hour to being in small groups where they are analyzing historical artifacts and talking with each other and coming up with their own creations, their own new knowledge. I've seen teachers recognize when their own conditioned biases are coming up. Mm-hmm. I've heard teachers say, I had a response to that student that now I recognize comes from the biases that I have internalized. I understand that that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. That doesn't mean I'm a racist person, but I have these beliefs that have been shaped by dominant culture, and they came out in the way I reacted to that student. And I want to explore that and unpack that and change those behaviors. So I've seen people recognize the complexity of what is happening in schools, recognize their own need for growth, recognize their need for attending to their own resilience, their emotions, their well-being. And I've seen people become leaders in many different ways, act on that sense of empowerment, step into their agency, and make proposals. That could be around aligning curriculum. It could be around a calendar. It could be around the way that students are organized in some way or another in the structures in the school. Because we have to talk about everything from our conversations and what comes up in our minds to the structures that we use in our school, to the master calendar schedules, to who teaches what classes, to who is in which positions. So all of those different elements that ultimately contribute to how we are flourishing or thriving in our schools does need to be addressed. And I use a systems thinking approach and model in my work that helps people make those connections. But we start with what's most within our sphere of control, which is what's going on in our minds. How are we feeling? How do we communicate to others?
Just to clarify for our listeners, what exactly then is a systems thinking approach, and how do you put this into practice in your work?
So at its most basic, a systems thinking approach is the recognition that everything that we experience is connected to something else. Nothing is isolation. When we can learn to see some of those connections, it helps us recognize where we can intervene in a system to make changes.
Yeah.
So, that could be something like, I'll see if I can give you a non-school example. I'm tired all the time. I'm exhausted. I'm not for real, but I'm giving you this example.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah, sure.
Say like someone complaining that they're exhausted all the time. They're tired.
Yeah.
And they say, I think I'm not getting enough sleep. So then we start probing into what's going on, and we can see the sort of trickle of impact and the different components of their life that are impacting their exhaustion. And then we might be able to figure out a key leverage point where we can make a shift or a change so that our actions are strategic and not just reactionary.
And I can see why systems thinking would be so important in a school environment where you've got people of such wide age ranges, working in such multifarious ways, a huge number of people, and not just in terms of the diversity of the people in the organization, but also the subject matter that's being studied, being taught, being learned, that itself is widely diverse, a number of different subjects and so on. Considering all those elements of the system, when you're trying to create a thriving school, I take it these are some of the factors you take into account when you're engaging in systems thinking to create a thriving educational institution.
Yeah, so we think about the school schedule, how students are slotted into classes, who can take which classes, prerequisites for classes, who teaches which classes. Typically, more experienced teachers will teach, perhaps sometimes in secondary school, they'll teach the more advanced courses. And so that means that the newer teachers are teaching the introductory classes, and that again, typically means that sometimes students with the greatest need are being taught by the teachers who are the newest and the least experienced. And so when we look at all of these, we could look at why is it that this group of students is always struggling in our school? And we might find answers when we look at the whole system and all of the different components.
So to bring this in connection, this and other things you said in connection with another important theme you mentioned earlier in our conversation, and you've written on it extensively. Several of your books are focused on how to help people build resilience, particularly for those in or working in education, but also just people outside education too. And there's a number of things I'd like to ask about this in connection with our conversation. But let's just start off with what are some of the most effective ways that you found to build resilience?
The number one most effective way to build your emotional resilience is to understand emotions, to accept them, to learn how to work with them, to learn how to appreciate them, to learn how to identify them when we are experiencing them, to learn what contributes to an emotion being uncomfortable, to learn how to get the most out of the pleasant emotions. So we all have this mindset that we don't want to have the bad emotions and we want to have the good ones. I would say there's no good, there's no bad. They're all essential and invaluable. And we want fear and we want to learn from fear. We don't want to get rid of fear. We want anger. Anger is an incredibly helpful emotion, but we want to work with them. We want to learn from them. We don't want them to rule our lives. So when we have the so-called positive emotions or the comfortable ones that we enjoy, how do we get the most out of them? How do we actually stop and savor and take them in and absorb them? And how do we notice those positive emotions or those pleasant, easy experiences more often? So in my book, Onward, I present 12 habits and 12 dispositions which help us become more resilient. They're all incredibly helpful. And they include things like build community, which is about that sense of belonging. And after doing this work now for 20 years with educators, I'm convinced that it is the habit of understanding emotions and learning how to work with our emotions. And that is something that I focus on work in schools and teachers. However, that's something that would help all of us, regardless of our work, that would help all of us have more meaningful lives in which we're flourishing.
Thank you. So I did, also want to talk about your book, Onward. That's your 2018 book, Onward, Cultivating Emotional Resilience in Educators. Those 12 science-backed habits that you put forward in that book that cultivate resilience and the correlative dispositions to these habits. Could you tell us a bit more how you identified these 12 habits?
Sure. So I love reading research, and I spent many years reading up about sort of what helps us to live the kind of meaningful, rewarding, good lives. I love reading I'm on my deathbed, here's what I had learned. That book was also informed by the decades that I'd spent working in education and seeing teachers struggle, as well as my own experiences. And so I came up with these 12 habits that, as I said, include build community. They include one called Be Here Now, which is really about learning and practicing mindfulness. Take care of yourself, celebrate and appreciate, be a learner. Those are some of the other habits. The dispositions include optimism. And again, there's so much research and science, perhaps on that one, backing the inclination towards optimism, towards helping us be more resilient. And understanding that, I'll just rewind for a second. And, resilience is our ability to respond to adversity and to change and to things that we don't want to have happen. And that will happen. We will have those experiences throughout our whole life. And how we respond is within our sphere of control. And we can learn those skills. And so that's one of the things that is overwhelmingly evident in the research, is that we can build our resilience. And I'm really focused on, okay, so what can we do? How do we do it? Teach me the skills. And so resilience it can sound like a disposition or an attitude, or like you've got it or you don't, but that's not accurate. We can build our resilience by doing hundreds of things every day. And what I've identified are the highest impact strategies.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to connect resilience up with some of the other themes that we've talked about today. So, for example, things we need to maybe learn, relearn, or unlearn. I can imagine that some people might have a certain conception of resilience, which you might argue is informed by certain structural ideas, that is, say, the way that society is structured, that we perhaps need to try to unlearn to have a more equitable model and understanding of resilience. Would that be an example of a skill that you think needs to be unlearned or relearned or just learned anew?
I'm not sure. So which would be the skill, the unlearning?
Oh, no. Well, the skill would be resilience, right? A character strength. I'm thinking of it as a skill here, right? So maybe that's where I'm not being entirely clear. Resilience is a character strength or a character virtue, if you like. So it's a skill one possesses in that sense of a character skill, something you can build, like you build other character skills. And just to connect it back with the various skills, pieces of knowledge, habits that you try to identify in your training that people may have that need to be unlearned or relearned because they are informed by aspects of society that prevent an equitable workplace or equitable learning institution. Is resilience, my question was, is resilience one of them? And then if so, to go further with that line of questioning.
Yeah, so I think, yes, there are a number of elements related to resilience that connect to that. So, for example, even the concept of resilience is about our emotions. Mm-hmm. And so I'll get really specific perhaps and see if this helps to answer your question. So in most of the world, men are socialized and conditioned into the belief that experiencing and expressing most emotions is not good, is not masculine, is not a way to demonstrate their strength or authority in the world. So that's a big unlearning. If you want to be more resilient, you have to accept that, wait, it's a human thing to have emotions, and it's actually a healthy thing to explore them and to express them. And there are ways that they can be explored and expressed that are conducive to individual and collective well-being and flourishing. And so there's a whole lot, so we can think about different groups of people and the socialization they've experienced around the value of emotions, how they can be expressed, where they can be expressed. And so we can start unlearning right there.
That's a great example of a kind of area of unlearning I thought might need to take place in that example you've given of the way in which there might be a certain model of resilience that's particularly popular and endorsed by men, or rather they're conditioned into believing this, where emotional expression would be anathema to being resilient. To be resilient would be to kind of be quite stoic in the face of adversity, such that you maybe don't express emotion at all, or if you do, you recover from it very quickly, as it were, you bounce back, as is often said about resilience. Whereas I take it you want to promote the idea that we need to cultivate a better awareness of our emotional experiences, build the skill of emotional regulation, allow ourselves to feel a certain emotion, and then that's part of perhaps the recovery that's built into the notion of resilience, that when you feel an emotion very strongly in response to adversity, you acknowledge it, you experience it, and you learn how to deal with it and manage it to recover from that experience of adversity, not only in terms of your cognition or your physical experience, but your emotional experience of it, which involves confronting it and expressing it too.
Yes. And so I think it's helpful for folks to understand, or I'm always compelled to do little mini lessons. So an emotion is a biochemical response that originates in the body in response to external stimuli. So we have emotions all day, every day. They're flooding through our system. They have a biochemical component. They become a feeling when we add stories to them. Often what happens is I might experience a surge of fear. So I'll give you a concrete example. I think the last question you asked, I wasn't able to hear. What's that? What's the question? I don't think I heard the question. And I had a moment, just a flash of fear, and I could feel the way it came through my body because I know what the signs are. And then the skill that I have built is to not tell a story that undermines my well-being. So a story that undermines my well-being could have been, oh, I'm not listening well. I shouldn't have come on this podcast. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm so embarrassed now. That happens a lot when we experience an emotion. We don't like that we experience the emotion. We go into this secondary emotion cycle of shame or fear or guilt or anger. And then you can just see how we're cycling out away from it. So the emotional regulation or the resilience response is recognizing, oh, look, there was a little flash of discomfort or fear. That's okay. I'm a human being. This happens. Ask for clarification. Done. Right? So 20 seconds later, I'm in a different place, and I didn't allow that spiral to happen.
Wow, that's fascinating. And that, I'm sure, is an extremely useful tool for listeners and for me, certainly. And by the way, I'm sure that was due to my poor phrasing and expression of the question rather than anything that you missed in your listening. But it's interesting. I mean, the questioner, I mean, you run a podcast as well, Elena, so I'm sure you've experienced this when you have that experience as the questioner too, right? The interviewer in these kind of contexts, when you're the interviewee asks for clarification, you get that, jolt inside. You think, oh no, did I ask a really inchoate, unclear question? Then what did I do wrong? How am I going to phrase this in a more clear way? So yeah, that absolutely resonates with me. Thank you. And that's really useful strategy.
Now, even like this is a really interesting incident in which we're creating a deeper connection just by sharing how we experience something. And you're recognizing, okay, you had a moment of discomfort there too. And then you worked with it and you shared your thoughts again, and we moved on. And this happens to us. Think about how many times this happens in a conversation, whether it's professional or personal, and that's how so often we have conflicts with each other, or we walk away feeling unsatisfied, is we don't have the skills to respond to what comes up within us. And in contrast, just even that little exchange of saying, oh, I had a moment where I could have gone in the direction of thinking that, but that was the story I could have told. And that's one of the other incredibly powerful strategies to cultivate resilience, is separating story from emotion and fact. And so much of our suffering comes from the story we tell about something, which not all stories are bad and not all stories are good. And ultimately they're just stories. But so often we tell stories that are not serving, that are undermine our well-being, undermine our agency, and so on, that are self-critical, that are self-judgmental. And so just having the awareness of, oh, that's the story I'm telling, and I don't have to tell it. What if it's not true? Maybe it's not true. Who would I be without that story? Helps us come back to really the present moment and the reality that we're in.
Absolutely love that. Thank you, Elena. So we're at the point of our final question now, which we call the flourishing question. We ask all of our guests this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So what is the one lesson on flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with? And what might be a practical step putting that lesson into action?
stay within your sphere of control, figure out what it is that you have the greatest influence on. And then I'm going to tell you that that has a lot to do with your emotions and what goes on in your mind. And you have choice over what you think. And you can learn so many strategies to cultivate awareness of what you're thinking. What you think influences how you feel, influences what you say, what you do, how you relate to others, the choices you make. And so cultivating awareness and learning how to shift those thoughts is within our control and is something that we can do. And it's actually a lot easier than it sounds. It's never been easier for us to cultivate awareness of our thoughts and to shift what's going on in that sometimes wonderful and sometimes challenging mass of, well, that's the brain. And there's a difference between the brain and the mind, but what's going on in our mind and our brain.
That is a wonderful parting note to finish on. Thank you so much, Elena. Before we go, would you like to tell our audience about your forthcoming book and where people can learn more about you online?
Yes. So my forthcoming book is Arise, the Art of Transformational Coaching, and it'll be out at the end of July 2024. And you can learn more about me and my work. Probably the best place to start is my website, which is brightmorningteam.com. And then there you'll find links to the social medias that we participate in and workshops and other books that I've written.
Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you, all of you listened, tuned in today to this episode of Flourish FM. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And we hope to see you or have you listening to us again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog. And every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.